In this episode, we meet Dr Kathie Irwin, scholar, senior public servant and leader of the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness in Aotearoa. Kathie is a third-generation Māori feminist educator, and she brings to this conversation decades of hard-won analysis about why Māori women arrive at 65 without economic security, not by chance, but by design. 3 generations of legislation, regulation and policy layered on top of one another, pointing women toward the lowest paid sectors of the labour market and keeping them there. In this episode, Kathie traces that machinery with precision from the 1847 Education Ordinance to today's retirement income policy, and asks what it would take to undo it. She talks about the power of capitalising the family benefit as a housing deposit, the vision of collective community housing as a genuine alternative to individualised solutions, and why New Zealand doesn't need to import new ideas. The answers, she argues, are already here. More information on this episode can be found in the episode description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Cha Hub podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from.
Kathie, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us today. We're deeply grateful. I thought we'd start by where we are and who you are.
Yeah, sure.
And it's lovely to see Mathieu and the landing place of Kupe out in the harbour shining bright today. Would you mind, just to kick things off, just to let us know a little bit about your background and how you've come to do the work that you do?
Okay. So, ko hekurangi, me maumau kāinga maunga, ko Ngāti Whare rākei pāka me Ngāti Kahinu ne ngā iwi, ko waiapu me nuhaka ngā awa, ko putanga me tāne nui ārangi ngā marae. I whānau au I Waipiro Bay, engari e tupu aki au I te tāne nui o here taunga ko Kathie Irwin ahau. I'm a third-generation Māori feminist educator. My grandmother took the decision in 1914 as a 14-year-old to pursue education and took up her first teaching position in 1918. She was born 1899, the 6th of 19 children. One of her daughters is my mother. She became a teacher. She married a teacher, had 3 children. I'm the baby. We're all teachers. Strong values-based whānau upbringing connected to the Presbyterian Church, Scottish and Orkney whakapapa lines in our family as well. And so we were brought up with a very strong work ethic and also a very clear understanding that we were gifted not only opportunities but responsibilities. So koha, pay forward, absolutely ingrained in who we are. And that's how I come to this work, through an academic background, a public service background, a senior leadership background across 3 Crown entities, 1 NGO, and the most at the time senior tagged role at ACC, which was still only level 3. There were 2 other Māori men at level 3 at the time, but they weren't in tagged roles. So if either of them left, a Māori wasn't necessarily going to be replaced in that role, but I was in a tagged Māori role. So bringing an integrated approach to how I walk on this planet is my mission and purpose. And this work for mana wāhine in a housing/homelessness context is a new iteration of it.
Thank you. We know from the research that wāhine Māori are significantly overrepresented in homelessness statistics. How does colonisation and the systemic inequities that are associated with it increase risk for wāhine Māori?
Yeah. So in a conference presentation I did yesterday on the gender analysis talk at the Papakāinga paradigm, which we've developed for the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness, I didn't, as clearly as I should have, articulate the intersectionality concept that underpins the work.
Here's a great opportunity.
And I've done it in my LinkedIn post this morning, which I'm going to direct you to, simply because it's now in the public arena in a much cleaner statement than I offered the audience yesterday. So the key thing is that it is the 3 compounding systems of power relations, hence the intersectionality of colonisation, capitalism and patriarchy, that position wāhine Māori to not only not benefit from the compound interest of investment over generations that other women are able to access, but actually to experience the compound impact of structural inequality over generations. So wāhine Māori are othered through colonisation, we are othered through patriarchy, we are othered through capitalism. Māori men are not othered through patriarchy, though through colonisation and capitalism. Pākehā women are not othered through colonisation, but through capitalism and through patriarchy. So wāhine Māori get to experience the othering through each of those three major systems of power relations in this country, and that's why the overlapping, compounding over time, intersectionality of how those power systems of power relations sit on us from a top-down perspective give us the stats that you see for wāhine Māori. What the international discourse on intersectionality doesn't do is it doesn't offer the ground-up reading, which I've put in my LinkedIn post today, the way in which mātauranga Māori and the Māori worldview, literally in a ground-up perspective, through the Māori social infrastructure of whānau hapu and iwi, tell a story of resistance and resilience that is unique in the world community. Now, I'm conscious when I say that there are many writers out in very informed scholarship positions at the moment who talk about there being no winners in colonisation, and that's certainly not the notion that I'm pointing to when I talk to the way in which the resilience and the resistance of wāhine Māori needs to be coded in its uniqueness in Aotearoa. It isn't that any kind of competition in colonisation, but it's just as untrue not to be able to code our actual experiences, because they are a unique combination read through the Māori cultural infrastructure in this country, a very unique combination that we actually don't see anywhere else in the world. Now, to say we don't see it anywhere else in the world is not to say that's a comparative judgment. Ko hikurangi te maunga o ngā tiparau. We don't see hikurangi as a maunga anywhere else in the world either. But that doesn't mean we can't, in our expression of pepeha and tribal identity, claim our maunga as the place in which we stand and hold our tūranga waiwai. So we need to be able to engage with international intellectual concepts on our own terms. And so what our work in this space and the intersectionality with Te Ao Māori, the Māori cultural infrastructure, Mātauranga Māori itself, read through the Māori cultural infrastructure and our own whānau hapu iwi social structure is how we tell our unique story. I had an example of the regularity with which I need to chart this kind of thinking in a conversation with a family member just recently who's a lawyer with a business in Hong Kong and Fiji, and who was talking to me about global influences and the Chinese economy and how it's currently being positioned. And I've just bought a new book from Chinese feminist economists that he recommended I read, and it arrived a week ago, so I'm going to follow up on that. That being the case, it still doesn't dislocate the 7-generation Ngāi Tahu pūrākau at an iwi level of what it took Ngāi Tahu to hold the mātauranga for their claim and to finally settle the claim under Sir Tipene O'Regan's leadership. Both narratives are real, neither is the primary narrative. And the fact that there is a beautiful new piece of work on the feminist analysis of the scholarship underpinning China's economic contribution, I can't wait to read. That is not something that displaces the Ngāi Tahu narrative. So we need to be better at holding two narratives simultaneously. Apirana Ngata would, in his E Tupu E Rea modelling, call it the dual world view approach. Neither is necessarily the major narrative. Perhaps I'm not being 100% honest there. Perhaps I do think the Māori narrative is the main one. But anyway, let's not go with that. Both narratives are real, and neither narrative should be read without the other. So some of the work I'm doing at the moment is at the interface of mana wāhine and Māori feminisms, connected to Apirana Ngata's tribal view that we need to do our best in both worldviews. And that's why the Māori feminisms is just as important to me as a political analysis as the mana wāhine. It's a different analysis, but it's two sides of the story we need going forward.
Reflecting on that and bring it into the lived experience and reality of our streets, even today here in Pōneke, where visible homelessness and rough sleeping has grown significantly yet again. One can't help but reflect on the move on occurring right back through colonisation and land grabs, the displacement and the traumatisation, and here we are again.
Modern version.
Can you help people perhaps who don't understand the links between all of those things?
The link is that the machinery of government is the biggest vehicle of colonisation. So colonisation didn't happen accidentally. It didn't come one day in a big rain, down from the skies, dropped these little kind of experiences of colonisation. The public policy machine itself. So when I'm talking machinery of government, I'm talking policy, legislation and regulation. How those three parts of government were shaped and formed by design to create the Māori outcomes we are seeing today, including homelessness. So here are the examples, because that piece in the jigsaw of our history of Aotearoa, that the machinery of government itself, that the public policy machine itself is the major vehicle of colonisation. That's a piece of the narrative that our schools don't teach people, that our officials in the public service don't get a good education about. And when you introduce that notion into professional development courses with people, there's almost a gagging reflection. What do you mean the machinery of government is a vehicle of colonisation? So I'll do a side example, and then I'm going to come back to 3 examples of policy, legislation and regulation, because people always want the facts, and trust me, we'd be here all day if we started listing out the actual examples that give the evidence to what I've just been talking about. But the side example, and this is not a sour grape story, but it is a real story. I worked as a chief advisor Māori to Andrew Beckcroft, Judge Andrew Beckcroft at the Children's Commission, and he got me to write a deputy commissioner's role for the office, which I did. It was just a secondment, so in that role. And then he said to me, "Are you going to apply for the job?" And I said, "Andrew, no, with respect, I want your job." So I've been number 2 to a whole lot of people all my life, and I want your job now. And so we had a good laugh. And then when he left, his job was advertised. So I applied for it, got shortlisted, 1 of 3 interviewed. And one of the people on the interview panel, there were 3. So one was a head of one Crown agency, the other was a head of another Crown agency, no names. But this person was a Māori man, so clearly from Te Punikokiri. So one of the things we had to do at the beginning of the interview was we got 5 minutes with no technology to say what is the one biggest issue the Office of the Children's Commissioner faces, and what would its impact be if it was resolved. So I chose that the Office of the Children's Commissioner should become a treaty-centred organisation, and that if it were, it would have an impact on the whole of the children's official infrastructure and landscape through Aotearoa in that leadership role. And then I made the case, including the machinery of government is the greatest vehicle of colonisation in this country, and that's what we have to decolonise, deconstruct and rebuild. So the person, the poor Māori man on the panel just about had heart failure, and his first question, which he came straight in with, was, "I just want to clarify, you're suggesting that the machinery of government is a vehicle of colonisation?" I said, "Yes." He didn't ask another question for 45 minutes. And I knew at that point I didn't have the job. So you have senior public officials shocked. Senior public officials, and this is not a personal criticism, this is an objective statement. Senior public officials who do not know the history of how colonisation enabled the public service to be built in New Zealand. It has a similar infrastructure in Canada, in Fiji, in Australia, wherever the British colonised. I can tell you some things that you will find in the Indigenous population because the machine was built the same. In fact, here's another side example. In 2013, it must have been, Christmas, I was in Boston. My daughter was at Harvard University doing a Master's Laws course, and Justice Joe Williams and his daughter came over to stay. The daughter is a good friend of my daughter, and Joe just happens to be a friend through the daughter's relationship. So I cooked big New Zealand Christmas dinner, and we were all sitting down eating, and Horiana had to go back to classes 2 days after that because America doesn't celebrate in the way we do. And we just said, "Oh, what's your first class?" And she said, "Well, actually, it's a class on, education for First Nations people in America, history and contemporary practice." And at the same time, Joe and I said, "Can we come?" And she had to ask the professor's permission for us to be able to go. But we got permission with the riders. We will sit at the back. We're not to ask any questions. And we're not to offer any sort of sounds during the lecture. So we buttoned up and went. As we sat there, it was absolutely clear I could have taught the first half of that class with the New Zealand examples, just changing the dates, and Joe could have done the second half from a legal perspective. And we shared that at the end of the lecture. She took us down to meet the lecturer, introduced him to Joe. He was, very impressed with Joe's pedigree and background. But that was the reality. Joe and I could have done that exact lecture with no preparation because the machine is so similar. That's the critical piece, that what is happening today has a historical context and background that is not factored in. Much policy analysis does not factor in structural inequality, and if you don't factor in structural inequality, you cannot change the outcomes for Māori that you're trying to change.
Building on that, and particularly drawing on your experience working in the Office of the Retirement Commission, we're seeing a rise in older adult women, Māori women, homelessness and precarious housing. You may have partially answered this already with what you've just said, but where do you see the root causes and the drivers of this?
Yeah. So what I didn't give you was the examples from the policy, legislation and regulation. So you get race relations policy until 1960 was assimilation. So the government view was the best approach for Māori moving forward was to become European as quickly as possible. Then you have the legislative piece, 1907 Tohunga Suppression Act, which made it illegal to practice traditional knowledge in a healing context. Midwives, healers, anybody in that healing space. Our knowledge was illegal by legislation in 1907. And another example at the regulatory level, although it's probably also at the legislative level. So in 1847, we didn't have in New Zealand the capacity to create laws. So ordinances were the legal equivalent, but I've put it in a regulatory context. 1847 Education Ordinance, the first time the Crown appropriates money for education. There were 4 conditions to get it. One was instruction had to be in English. So that's the regulatory example. All of that is a machine designed to say to Māori, your future is semi-skilled or unskilled. You will be the servants of the broader non-Māori community around you. That's your destiny. That's your place. That's our government policy. And you ought to be satisfied with that. Well, we never were. Our tipuna never bought into any of that. And so what you have in a modern context of older women present, and I am one of those women. So I was 4 years old, 1960. I was 4 years old before the government changed the official policy from assimilation to a more general policy. What you have with older women my age, in that I turned 70 in a month, so in that retirement space, you have women who were raised in this policy space thinking they need to be European, and you have policy and legislation and regulation designed to deliver that outcome. So 1847 Education Ordinance, just the first example. So across generations, our women, so we are talking about our own grandmothers and great-grandmothers. So it's our own grandmothers. I don't even have to go to the great-grandmother level. At my grandmother's level, you have a society in which the only place for her was in the lower paid sector of the labour market. So issues of pay equity today are because the government channelled women into a small set of labour market opportunities in the workforce, and they were paid differentially. So we're not being channelled into the entrepreneurial, high-paying sectors. So across time, you are in the semi-skilled or low-skilled, poorly paid sectors of the labour market. You are being conditioned by society to feel that your role is to be less than non-Māori women, and that you ought to be satisfied with that. So you get to 60, you don't turn up at 65 as an older Māori woman with poor economic opportunities by chance. You've been tracking there for 3 or 4 generations, and that's the point people don't get in the retirement income space. What's happening for older Māori women now is something designed for many generations ago and something that they've experienced all their lives. And so you also get people arriving at that place and thinking, I've worked all my life to now not be able to afford necessarily to be Māori. So I'm a native, let's say I'm a native speaker. Okay, I'm the Kaihautū Reo Marae, and I don't live at home. So if there's a tangi at home and I'm in Wellington and the tangi's up the East Coast, that's an 8-hour drive, and it's probably a 3 or 4 day trip, and I can't afford to do it. I can't afford to go there. I can't afford to be Māori in my old age. And that's the economic precarity that is compounded across generations, across sectors. So socially, through experiences of structural violence and whānau and domestic violence in some cases, economically through the pay inequity, the gender and ethnic pay inequity, and culturally through the way in which the English language and culture still, heaven forbid, we've got legislation that is now proposing that English becomes an official language in New Zealand because people aren't convinced that 186 years of monolingualism and monoculturalism is wedded in enough. So now we need legislation. But they've lived with all of that and arrive at 65 without the economic means that some other women do. And then you have, and what I think is, and I did describe it this way yesterday, and I've thought about that and I still stand by it, I think one of the most cruel pieces of policy advice that I've seen in the last 40 years, and that is a current retirement income policy statement in which there is no account of historical, structural or epistemological racism, none at all. Yeah. So then there's a little chapter on how to deal with and understand ethnicity and a number of other, no treaty analysis. And in the recommendations, one of the recommendations points to the need for possibly some better advice on how to save. So salt in the wound. So the Crown creates structural inequality across generations, channels Māori women into the lower paid areas of the labour market, pays them less as a society through gender and pay inequity, and then suggests that maybe what would help us if we help you learn how to save those 2 pennies you were able to put together just a little bit better. Not good. Salt in the wound.
Kathie, we are preparing a special publication and wanting to be courageous and bold in policy recommendations. And I don't want to limit you to the housing realm because it's too narrow. All of these things are connected. Work and income and housing affordability are obviously connected. If we had the opportunity to fundamentally rewrite some of our policies and set a new policy direction where we would see all of our people well housed, can you give me some idea of what direction you would go in?
Sure. So here's the thing. This country used to have much better Māori home ownership rates. Not that long ago, in my lifetime. So what was the key to that? One of the keys was whānau could capitalise what was called family benefit. Okay? So if you had 4 children, the state could work out how much the family benefit of those children would be, say, I don't know, let's say over a 15-year period, you got it as a lump sum, you used it as a deposit to buy a house. That's an idea the Crown can invest in.
Yeah. Dust off that old policy and bring it back again.
So here's the thing. Sometimes people find new ideas scary. All right, let's own some of the ones. So we love celebrating we're the first in the world to give women the vote. We love that. I love it too. We love our nuclear-free policy. We love that. I love it too. Well, I happen to love policies like the old policy that enabled you to capitalise on family benefit, and for the state to say, this is not a handout, because you were going to get that money anyway. It's a hand up.
Yeah,
and it only takes one lump sum, and then you're in a house. And being a homeowner, we saw yesterday the incredible way in which home ownership and housing stability contributes to better outcomes from general health, hospitalisation, GP visits, mental health, income levels, experiences with justice, criminalisation, a range of indicators that went that way rather than that way when housing and housing stability was secured. So the investment is for the Crown to proactively be able to say to people, we will help you get into a house. If you don't need to capitalise on your family benefit, if your whānau already own a housing portfolio, fabulous. Invest as you will. But if you do need support from the state, let's make it real, let's make it concrete, and let's not bring in any solutions from overseas. We've got our own best practice that worked for many years and enabled Māori home ownership to be significantly better than it is today. You've still got issues, are there enough houses out there? Those are different issues. Access for us in the first instance is the first one. How do we get access to a deposit sufficient to buy a home?
Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful. What tangible outcomes would you like to see in the next 10 years for women experiencing homelessness in Aotearoa? Yeah. Are there some changes that you can suggest?
So the biggest one for me, so I'm coming from a mana wāhine position. I'm coming from a te tiriti space. And I want to see more examples of strengths-based cultural housing options. So in our traditional Māori worldview, the collective papakāinga model of us living together on ancestral land in whānau hapuiwi infrastructure and in community. That's a model. That is a fabulous model. So when we are talking about housing options for women and particularly options being developed in the homelessness space, I'm not hearing anybody talking women-only urban papakāinga. Maybe I'm just not reading enough, maybe I'm just not well connected enough, but I'm hearing people talking, and you know, this is a way of understanding provision. It's not a criticism in any way. You asked me what would I like to see. I would like to see the range of options expanded so that urban papakāinga, women-only urban papakāinga, they may branch out and connect into other papakāinga later when women feel safe enough or choose to branch out. But a women-only collective papakāinga option, I think, is the one that's missing. Now, I've got a friend in Taranaki, Kaihautū, who has been working for 25 years with her people at their invitation to develop a wisdom village model. So that's going to be she wants a kohanga on site, a kura on site, because the karaua want and the nannies want their mokopuna running around with them. It's a residential village in which there are intergenerational housing options. Many other residential villages do not have intergenerational housing options. So this will be a place that not only is there a kohanga and a kura on site, but the mokopuna and the parents can live with the grandparents if they want to, because the housing options are intergenerational. You know, that kind of creativity is where individual townhouses for one person are a fabulous option. And quite frankly, I might want one of those in the future. But at the other end of the cultural spectrum is the papakāinga on traditional whenua, and lots of those are developing now. A papakāinga in Otani in the Hawke's Bay just had a symposium on Saturday. They sold tickets for $100 and heaps of people went to learn how to build a papakāinga because they've done it. So, that's that option. And then the option just back from that, if you can't build a papakāinga on your traditional whenua because for whatever reason that whenua has been taken out of your family's control, then a second option, an approximation, a kaupapa-based approximation, is still the concept of papakāinga on whenua that people don't have to buy. So whether a charity buys it or whether government creates it as an option, as a women-only place to come together in community. Now, the research we heard yesterday, fabulous research from the Wellington City Council, talked about wāhine once housed experiencing, for some of them, a phenomenon of isolation. And in one case, I think the research reported a person was almost at the point of going back to the street because they found it lonelier to be in a house without support and without connection than to be on the street. What a papakāinga does for a group of women is it creates community by virtue of the collective design, and it means that there can be individual. So you think communal facilities, but also individual. If you want to cook on your own in your whare, you can do that. But there's a dining hall that's a collective one. So you interface the best of strengths-based, cultural informed, individual provision, intergenerational if people want to bring mokopuna, options that are broader than those framed by a monocultural Western view. That's what I want to see. So you ask me my best solution for the future. I probably have less control over the possibility of what happens on traditional whenua, the strongest cultural option, but the kaupapa option of an urban-based papakāinga for women coming into a space of leaving the streets, moving from the streets into housing, and then from there finding their pathway forward, because what the Wisdom Village is doing in Taranaki is that is a learning and cultural and educational hub, So Wharetiaki Wāhine Refuge out in Porirua in December of last year opened a community hub as well. So they are going to offer wāhine education and learning pathways forward from a refuge space. And what we know about the Human Rights Commission Pacific Pay Equity campaign of the last few years is that when they gathered the data on Māori women, one of the causal factors for Māori women's economic location was education level. So we can't do some things about factors at the macro level, perhaps, as quickly as we want to, but you can do something about a woman's education level, and particularly through second chance education. That's my academic background. And so for the Women's Refuge, the Te Wharetiaki Wāhine Refuge in Porirua, to be directly connected with their new community learning hub to bring women into safety, physical, cultural and psychological, and then straight into a connected learning environment to open up different pathways forward. That's a fabulous combination. Yeah, that's a fabulous combination. The Human Rights Commission research found that across a Māori woman's working life, we miss out on over $400,000 because of ethnic and gender pay equity. And that's been calculated by statisticians, not someone like me. Māori men miss out on $175,000. So the difference, the intersectionality component for Māori women is more severe.
Yep.
But our men are also missing out on $175,000 through ethnic pay differences. So this is real. There are places in New Zealand you can buy a house for $400,000. This set of circumstances and how they land on Māori women is very real. And if it can be designed in the way that it has been, it can be designed out. And that's why we do the work that we do.
Is it fair to say, Kathie, that these circumstances are compounded by the fact that Māori women are often either caregivers or have young children, and that's in the mix as well, which possibly complicates the ability to access education?
Yeah, so one of the things, so we talk about compound interest and compound impact. So, people who do well in society can often benefit from compound interest because the system has been designed in their favour and they're kind of on the train and they go with it. Our women have all of those have structural and institutional factors compounding against them. And that's what you're talking there about, how intersectionality also impacts on real women's lives. So patriarchy as a system of economic relations assumed men would have children, assumed someone else would look after them, assumed they wouldn't need parental leave because they weren't going to be looking after the children, assumed they wouldn't need early childhood because someone else would be looking. We're the someone else's. The women are the someone else's, looking after the children, doing the early childcare. So the way in which patriarchy as an economic system was set up, dislocated and othered, this is what we mean by othering women. It was designed to suit men's interests. So I didn't have my first child till I was 30. I was already a tenured senior lecturer at a university. I could easily have had no children and quite possibly become the first Māori woman Vice-Chancellor in New Zealand. That was a possible trajectory. We could debate whether that's a useful trajectory for one to have, but it could have been there. But you choose to become a mother, and you choose to work once you've become a mother, and you say to yourself, I didn't know any man at the university who didn't have children because they were an academic. And that's how the economic system gives privilege to maleness and to men at the expense of women. And that's what we mean by intersectionality opens the doors on all of the ways that capitalism benefits men, that patriarchy benefits men, that capitalism benefits those who can be the owners of production and the business people, and benefits those who colonisation has displaced off their own lands and out of their own language and culture. All of that lands on wāhine Māori and contributes to the stats we have that get reported to the United Nations every 3 years, to the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination of All Forms for Women, which New Zealand is a signatory of. And they're negative, those reports, in environmental and social and in economic terms. But in cultural terms, they're not, because the revolution in this country in language and culture revitalisation through kohanga reo, kurikaupua and wānanga, certainly in the kohanga space, is led by women, led by wāhine Māori. 91% of the kaimahi in kohanga in December 21 were wāhine Māori. So the revolution is led by women, and in that space, when we report to the United Nations, that's a positive. So you've got 3 negatives and a positive, and that positive is being called on by the rest of the world to understand more fully, to see if it's actually a model that can be exported internationally, exported in inverted commas.
Beautiful word, revolution, and the green shoots of that beginning in the space you've described. I'd like to run an idea past you, which, given you've come from a faith background, reflecting on, for example, the Old Testament, there's not one single, if you do a relative comparison between te ao Māori concepts of whenua and land and the biblical, there's not a single mention of private land ownership in the Old Testament.
So,
isn't that interesting? So
years ago, we took a teacher training program to the East Coast from Christchurch. Right? So I went home to the East Coast on sabbatical in 1997. Had to have a big fight with Victoria to get approval to do it. It was easier for them to say I can go to Paris than to Aotearoa, but we won. We went home. And once I got there, the Education Review Office released a report on East Coast schooling and how shocking it was. Right? I was in the front row of the school in Te Aotearoa when Judith Aitken, the CEO of the Education Review Office, walked through the door to deliver the report in person. She looked at the front row, nearly died, and said, "What are you doing here?" While I was there, the report was damning, absolutely damning. While I was home, the people came to me and said, "Okay, if those teachers suck so badly, you go and find a teacher education program and bring it here. Bring it here. We're not going there. We're not going there for 6 weeks at a time. They have to come here for the whole time. We're not compromising who we are as Ngāti Porou, so that has to be." So there was about 7 things on the list. Anyway, Christchurch College of Education were the only place that would meet all of those requirements. They already had distance education programs as a pilot, so they had a model.
Yeah. So carrying that theme through into whenua,
yep,
and the concepts we have around land and the purpose of the earth and its resources, one of the things we're thinking deeply about within the community sector, particularly with regards housing, and the clear now 40 years of evidence, it's longer for Māori, I accept, but with the neoliberal reforms of the 80s and 90s, it's accelerated the deficit of affordable housing for low and moderate income households. It's destroyed home ownership, which is steep in decline and has been for decades, especially for Māori. We're thinking about how we can reinvigorate the commons in Aotearoa. And what I mean by the commons is the concept of community benefit, the concept of denying the market forces and removing land and homes, as many homes as we possibly can, and claiming mana motuhake. And it might be papakāinga, it might be community land trusts, it might be products like Secure Home, where people can build their well-being and whānau at the centre rather than the market, which has severe limitations which are very obvious to anyone who's paying attention in New Zealand and most of the developed world. How does that concept feel for you? Because in some ways, through whenua Māori and papakāinga, it has a standing in Te Ao Māori already. And we're not reinventing a new thing. Yeah. It's something we already have available to us in Aotearoa.
Yeah. So one of the concepts that's critical is whakapapa. So in our worldview, humanity is born of the whenua. So in our narrative, we aren't from Adam's rib. Our narrative is that we are of the whenua. We are literally born of the whenua. And so kaitiakitanga, the way of guardianship, is a powerful way of naming the relationship between humanity and the taiao. So in our worldview, we have a whakapapa relationship with the taiao, not an extractive one, a whakapapa relationship. That is one of the biggest clashes with Western worldviews. Western worldview doesn't have an actual whakapapa relationship with whenua. We do. And so kaitiakitanga, guardianship, is much more powerful to argue in a Māori worldview space because it is us literally caring for the whenua that we were born of. So you've got some very powerful coding from the Māori world and collective notions built into that so that your community parallel in a whānau hapua niwi social infrastructure is closer than in some other contexts because it's already there. The other thing I'd suggest to just as an option is, the rent to buy soft option so that if people do want to become homeowners, whatever that means for them, that rent to buy is another way to move people in. Iwi have got capital reserves. They could be setting a portion aside. So you've got some parallels in the Māori world for notions of common, kaitiakitanga, notions of open development. That's your whānau hapua niwi social structure that's not just about rights of individuals, it's about opportunities and responsibilities to the whenua, so that people are able to not only come from that whenua, but to go back to it. So one of the new things that's happening in our society is that people are now being cremated, which in my view wasn't an old way, wasn't an old thing, but some of it's about there not being room to be buried, that the whenua is so scarce that people are choosing cremation rather than literally taking up land plots. So we've got to go back to what's the relationship we have with Papa Tuanuku and all of her resources, and then how is Papa Tuanuku able to care for humanity so that that relationship can be a caring one and people aren't making social choices about choosing cremation because they don't think there's a space to be buried.
Have you got an example of a public policy initiative that might speak into this space that you could walk us through?
So the Coalition to End Women's Homelessness have commissioned the design of a tool to work in this space, a gender analysis tool from a Te Ao Māori lens. It's called the Papa Tuanuku Paradigm, and it locates the need to explore homelessness with a view to ending it, historically, structurally, epistemologically, structurally, institutionally, personally, for people from a broad gender identification base, moving forward strategically into Aotearoa nation building. It's available on the website, free to download. We're about to release a series of videos on how to use it and also a study guide on how to work with it in organisations if you want to use it as a training resource for your staff.
Dr Kathie Irwin, thank you very much for coming and taking time with us. I really appreciate it.
We'd like to thank Kathie for taking the time to speak with us for this episode. More information on this episode can be found in the episode description. And don't forget to subscribe to the Cha Hub podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from.